Hello friends, did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Texas Stetson had heard every excuse, every sob story, and every desperate plea during his 15 years patrolling the scorching highways between Houston and Beaumont. The humidity hung in the air like a wet blanket even at 2 a.m., and the asphalt still radiated heat from the relentless August sun that had baked southeast Texas for another punishing day. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for the call. That came through his radio at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. That would forever change how he viewed the seemingly innocent crime of telephone fraud. The dispatch came in as a welfare check at 1247 Pine Ridge Road in the small town of Dayton, Texas. Population 7,242, according to the fading welcome sign that greeted visitors with promises of friendly neighbors and small-town charm. The caller, a concerned neighbor named Dorothy Whitfield, reported that her 78-year-old neighbor hadn't been seen for 3 days, which was unusual for a woman who typically maintained a predictable routine of morning garden work and evening porch sitting that served as the informal neighborhood watch system. Frank knew Pine Ridge Road well. It was one of those streets that seemed frozen in the 1960s, where elderly residents had lived in the same modest houses for decades, watching their neighborhood gradually change as younger families moved away and properties were subdivided or abandoned. The street was lined with aging oak trees that provided blessed shade during the brutal Texas summers, but also created pockets of darkness that could conceal activities both innocent and sinister. The house at 1247 was a small white frame structure with a well-maintained garden and a front porch that showed signs of regular use. Wind chimes hung motionless in the still night air, and a porch light burned steadily, suggesting that someone was either home or had left it on for security purposes. Frank approached the front door with the cautious optimism that characterized most welfare checks, hoping to find a resident who was simply tired or sick, rather than discovering something that would require a more complex investigation. His knocking produced no response, but he could hear the sound of a television playing inside the house, volume turned up high enough to be audible through the walls. This was not unusual in a house occupied by an elderly person who might have hearing difficulties, but it also meant that his knocking might not be audible to anyone inside the residence. Frank tried the doorbell, which produced a clear chiming sound inside the house, but still received no response from any occupants. After several attempts to make contact through conventional means, Frank decided to check the perimeter of the house for any signs of forced entry or unusual activity that might explain why the resident was not responding. The backyard was as well maintained as the front, with a small garden that showed recent care, and a back porch that contained a lawn chair positioned to overlook the garden area. The back door was unlocked, which was not unusual in small Texas towns where many elderly residents still maintained the trusting habits of an earlier era. Frank called out as he entered, identifying himself as a police officer, responding to a welfare check and requesting any occupants to make their presence known. The television was indeed playing loudly in the front room, a late-night movie channel showing an old western that seemed incongruous with the growing sense of unease that Frank felt as he explored the quiet house. Helen Bradshaw, the resident, was found in her bedroom, sitting upright in a chair beside her bed with her telephone receiver held to her ear. At first glance, she appeared to be sleeping, but closer inspection revealed that she had been dead for several days, apparently having died while engaged in a telephone conversation that she believed involved a family emergency requiring immediate financial assistance. The phone was still active, connected to a number that Frank would later learn belonged to a sophisticated fraud operation that kept victims on the line for hours or even days, extracting banking information and personal details through carefully scripted conversations that exploited the victims' love for their grandchildren and their willingness to help family members in crisis situations. The crime scene told a story that would haunt Frank for years to come. Helen's bedroom contained evidence of frantic activity during her final hours. Bank statements scattered across her bed, checkbooks with multiple torn-out entries, and handwritten notes containing routing numbers and account information that she had apparently provided to the caller during what she believed was a desperate attempt to help her grandson Walter, who was supposedly in jail and needed bail money. The telephone conversation had continued for an estimated 72 hours, during which Helen had remained on the line almost continuously, receiving periodic updates about Walter's supposed legal situation and increasingly urgent requests for additional funds to address new complications in his case. The scammers had used sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques to keep Helen engaged and compliant, exploiting her natural concern for her grandson while gradually extracting access to her savings accounts and pension funds. What made the scene particularly disturbing was the evidence that Helen had died while still trying to help her grandson. Her final handwritten notes, found clutched in her free hand, contained additional bank account numbers and authorization codes that she had been preparing to provide when her heart apparently gave out from the stress and exhaustion of the prolonged fraud operation. The phone line was still active when Frank arrived, connected to what appeared to be an automated system that played periodic recordings designed to maintain the victim's attention and compliance. The recordings featured a young man's voice, allegedly Walter, pleading for continued assistance and thanking Helen for her help, while expressing increasingly desperate concern about his legal situation and the consequences he would face without additional financial support. Frank's investigation into Helen's death revealed the sophisticated nature of modern telephone fraud operations and the devastating impact they could have on vulnerable elderly victims who were isolated from family members and community support systems that might have recognized the signs of victimization. Helen's grandson, Walter, was alive and well, living in Oregon, and had no knowledge of his grandmother's death until contacted by investigators. The bank records showed that Helen had wired over $47,000 to various accounts during the 3-day conversation, representing virtually her entire life savings in the inheritance she had planned to leave to her grandchildren. The money had been transferred to accounts that were immediately closed, and the funds forwarded to additional accounts in a complex money laundering scheme that made recovery nearly impossible. But the most chilling aspect of the case was the realization that Helen had died believing she was helping her beloved grandson, never knowing that she was actually being victimized by criminals who had researched her family connections and used her love for Walter as a weapon against her. Her death had occurred while she was still on the phone with the scammers, who had continued their fraud operation even after she stopped responding to their requests. The investigation led Frank into the dark world of grandparent scams, where criminal organizations used publicly available social media information to research elderly victims and their family relationships, then crafted convincing emergency scenarios that exploited the victim's natural desire to help family members in crisis. The scammers had known Walter's name, his approximate age, his location, and enough personal details to make their story believable to a grandmother who had not spoken to him in several months. Working with federal investigators, Frank learned that Helen's case was part of a larger operation that had targeted hundreds of elderly victims across the Southwest, using similar techniques to extract millions of dollars from victims who believed they were helping family members with legal problems, medical emergencies, or other crisis situations that required immediate financial assistance. The scammers operated from call centers that moved frequently to avoid law enforcement detection, using voice-over internet protocol technology to disguise their actual locations, while maintaining phone numbers that appeared to be local to their victims' areas. Their scripts were carefully crafted to create maximum emotional impact, while minimizing the time victims had to think critically about the situations being described. The psychological manipulation techniques used in Helen's case were sophisticated and cruel, designed to keep victims emotionally engaged, while gradually extracting financial information and access to their accounts. The scammers had used time pressure, family loyalty, and fear of consequences to prevent Helen from contacting other family members or seeking advice that might have revealed the fraudulent nature of the emergency. Frank's investigation revealed that the scammers had specifically targeted Helen because their research indicated she lived alone, had limited contact with other family members, and maintained substantial savings accounts that would be accessible through wired transfers. Her isolation made her an ideal victim for a prolonged fraud operation that required sustained psychological manipulation to be successful. The call center responsible for Helen's death was never located despite extensive efforts by federal investigators who traced the phone calls through multiple countries and jurisdictions. The complexity of the operation and its international scope made prosecution difficult, even when individual scammers were identified through voice recognition technology and communication intercepts. Frank attended Helen's funeral, where he met Walter, the grandson whose voice had been impersonated during the fatal phone calls. Walter's grief was compounded by guilt over his lack of recent contact with his grandmother and his knowledge that her love for him had been used as a weapon against her by criminals who felt no remorse for destroying an elderly woman's final years. "She died trying to help me," Walter told Frank after the service, "but I didn't even know she was in trouble. The people who did this to her turned her love into a trap, and she walked into it because she cared about family more than she cared about protecting herself from strangers who would lie to her about people she loved." The case prompted Frank to begin educating elderly residents in his patrol area about grandparent scams and the techniques used by telephone fraudsters to exploit family relationships. He developed presentations for senior centers and community groups, explaining how scammers researched potential victims and crafted believable emergency scenarios that could fool even cautious individuals. But despite his educational efforts, Frank continued to encounter similar cases throughout his patrol area. The scammers adapted their techniques faster than law enforcement could develop, countermeasures using new technologies and psychological manipulation methods to stay ahead of prevention efforts while targeting an increasingly vulnerable elderly population that was isolated from family support, systems and community connections. The most disturbing aspect of Helen's case was the realization that modern telephone technology had been weaponized to exploit the most basic human emotions, love for family and the desire to help others in crisis. The scammers had used Helen's virtues against her, turning her compassion and generosity into vulnerabilities that could be exploited for financial gain without regard for the human cost. 6 months after Helen's death, Frank responded to another welfare check, this time at 892 Elm Street, where 81-year-old Eugene Patterson was found in similar circumstances, having died while on the phone with scammers, who convinced him that his granddaughter needed emergency medical funds. Eugene's case showed identical patterns to Helen's death, suggesting that the same criminal organization was continuing to operate with impunity. The pattern repeated with disturbing regularity throughout Frank's patrol area, as elderly residents fell victim to increasingly sophisticated telephone fraud operations that used research, psychology and technology to create convincing emergency scenarios that exploited victims' love for their families. Each case showed the same tragic elements: isolation, manipulation, financial devastation and death that occurred while victims believed they were helping loved ones. Frank's reports on grandparent scam deaths began attracting attention from federal agencies investigating organized fraud operations. But the international scope and technological sophistication of the criminal networks made prosecution difficult and prevention nearly impossible. The scammers operated with apparent immunity, protected by jurisdictional complications and the difficulty of tracing their operations across multiple countries and communication systems. The psychological impact on Frank was profound, as he realized that his traditional law enforcement training had not prepared him to deal with crimes that used love and family loyalty as weapons against vulnerable victims. The telephone. Fraudsters were committing murder by psychological manipulation, causing fatal stress and exhaustion in elderly victims who died believing they were saving family members from crisis situations that existed only in the criminals' carefully crafted scenarios. During one particularly disturbing case 3 months later, Frank discovered 73-year-old Ruth Blackwood dead in her living room, surrounded by empty prescription bottles. The coroner determined she had taken a fatal overdose of her heart medication while on the phone with scammers who were demanding she send additional money to help her grandson Gary, who they claimed was hospitalized after a car accident and needed funds for emergency surgery that insurance wouldn't cover. Ruth's phone records showed she had been on the line for nearly 18 hours, during which the scammers had systematically extracted information about her medical conditions, her medications, and her fears about her grandson's welfare. They had used her own health problems against her, suggesting that stress from Gary's situation might trigger her own cardiac episodes if she didn't act quickly to resolve the crisis. The prescription bottles found around Ruth's body had been emptied in what appeared to be a desperate attempt to calm her heart, palpitations, and anxiety during the prolonged phone conversation. The scammers had continued talking to her, even as she became increasingly incoherent, encouraging her to take more medication to calm down so she could focus on helping Gary with his medical emergency. Frank's investigation revealed that Ruth had wired over $35,000 to the scammers during the 18-hour conversation, liquidating her retirement accounts and borrowing against her home's equity to generate the funds they claimed were needed for Gary's medical care. The real Gary was contacted in California, where he was working as a software engineer, and had no knowledge of his grandmother's death until investigators informed him. They turned her own medicine into a weapon, Gary told Frank during Ruth's funeral. She was so scared about what might happen to me that she poisoned herself, trying to calm down enough to save someone who was never in danger. They killed her with kindness, making her think she was helping family when she was actually helping the people who were murdering her. The sophistication of these operations became even more apparent when Frank investigated the death of 69-year-old Margaret Foster, who had been found dead in her garage, apparently having suffered carbon monoxide poisoning while sitting in her running car with her phone pressed to her ear. Margaret had been on the line with scammers for over 12 hours, during which they convinced her that her granddaughter Betty was being held hostage by drug dealers who would kill her unless ransom money was provided immediately. The scammers had instructed Margaret to go to her garage for privacy during the sensitive financial transactions, then had kept her on the line while she wired money from her car using her mobile banking application. They had encouraged her to keep the car running for warmth during the long financial process, never mentioning the danger of carbon monoxide poisoning in an enclosed space. Margaret's bank records showed she had transferred over $52,000 to various accounts during the 12-hour period, with the transactions becoming increasingly erratic as carbon monoxide poisoning affected her judgment and coordination. The final transaction, attempted just minutes before her death, was incomplete due to her inability to properly enter the required security codes. The real Betty, contacted in Arizona, where she was teaching elementary school, was devastated to learn that her grandmother had died believing she was in mortal danger. "She died thinking she was saving my life," Betty sobbed during their phone conversation. "But the only people who wanted to hurt me were the ones she was trying to protect me from. They used her love for me to kill her, and I didn't even know she was in trouble." Frank's investigation into Margaret's death revealed that the scammers had researched her family extensively, knowing that Betty had previously struggled with substance abuse issues that had been discussed in social media posts by concerned family members. This information had been used to craft a convincing hostage scenario that played on Margaret's known concerns about her granddaughter's safety and past associations with dangerous individuals. The psychological profiles developed for these cases showed that the scammers specifically targeted elderly individuals who were isolated, had limited contact with family members, and maintained substantial financial assets that could be accessed through electronic transfers. They used sophisticated research techniques to gather personal information about potential victims and their family relationships, creating detailed dossiers that allowed them to craft convincing emergency scenarios tailored to each victim's specific vulnerabilities and concerns. Frank's patrol area had become a hunting ground for these criminal organizations, which used the isolation and trust of rural Texas communities as weapons against elderly residents who had no reason to suspect that their telephones had become tools of sophisticated psychological warfare. The crimes were particularly cruel because they used the victims' best qualities, their love for family and their willingness to sacrifice for others, as the mechanisms of their own destruction. and the investigation expanded when Frank discovered that similar deaths were occurring throughout East Texas, with a pattern that suggested coordinated operations, targeting elderly residents in rural communities where limited law enforcement resources made detection and investigation more difficult. The scammers appeared to be working from lists of potential victims that had been compiled through data mining operations that identified elderly individuals with specific demographic and financial characteristics. Working with federal investigators, Frank learned that the grandparent scam operations responsible here for these deaths were part of larger criminal enterprises that generated hundreds of millions of dollars annually through telephone fraud targeting elderly Americans. The operations were typically based in foreign countries with limited extradition agreements, making prosecution nearly impossible, even when specific individuals were identified through voice recognition technology and communication intercepts. The automated systems used by these operations were sophisticated enough to continue functioning, even when victims died during the phone calls, with recorded messages and interactive response systems that could maintain the fiction of ongoing emergencies for hours or even days after victims had stopped responding. This technological persistence meant that evidence of the crimes often remained active when law enforcement arrived at crime scenes, providing detailed records of the psychological manipulation that had led to each victim's death. Frank's reports on these cases began attracting attention from national media outlets, highlighting the growing epidemic of telephone fraud targeting elderly Americans and the inadequacy of existing law enforcement tools for addressing crimes that combined international operations, sophisticated technology, and psychological manipulation in ways that traditional investigative techniques were not equipped to handle. The emotional toll on Frank was severe, as he struggled to understand how criminals could systematically exploit love and family loyalty for financial gain without regard for the human suffering they caused. His sleep was often interrupted by nightmares about elderly victims dying alone, while strangers on the phone extracted their life savings through carefully crafted lies about family emergencies that existed only in the criminal's profit-driven imagination. Today, Pine Ridge Road in Dayton remains quiet, with many of Helen's neighbors having moved away or died of natural causes, leaving empty houses and overgrown gardens where elderly residents once maintained the informal community connections that might have protected them from sophisticated fraud operations. Frank continues to patrol the area, but the memory of Helen's death serves as a constant reminder of how modern criminal organizations can use technology and psychology to exploit the most fundamental human emotions. The house at 1247 Pine Ridge Road stands empty now, with Helen's garden slowly being reclaimed by weeds and her wind chimes hanging silent in the still Texas air. But sometimes on quiet nights when Frank drives past the property, he reports that he can still hear the sound of a telephone ringing inside the dark house, as if the scammers are still trying to reach their victim, unaware that their psychological warfare finally succeeded in killing the woman whose only crime was loving her grandson enough to give everything she had to help him. The grandparent scam operation that killed Helen Bradshaw was never dismantled. According to federal investigators who continue to track similar fraud operations across the country, the criminals adapted their techniques and moved their operations, but they continued to target elderly victims with the same ruthless efficiency that characterized Helen's case, using love and family loyalty as weapons in a war against America's most vulnerable citizens. Frank's final report on Helen's death concluded with a warning that would prove prophetic. The telephone has become a weapon in the hands of criminals who understand human psychology better than most law enforcement officers understand criminal behavior. They are not just stealing money, they are stealing lives, using our own emotions against us in ways that traditional police work is not equipped to prevent or punish. The voice on Helen's phone when Frank found her body was still speaking, still requesting additional financial information, still playing recordings of the fake Walter, asking for more help. The system was so automated and persistent that it continued operating even after its victim had died, a technological horror that epitomized the inhuman efficiency of modern fraud operations that treat human suffering as a renewable resource to be exploited without limit or conscience. The investigation files on Helen Bradshaw's death remain open, though no arrests have been made and no recovery of the stolen funds has been achieved. The case serves as a haunting reminder that in the digital age, the most dangerous predators are not those who break into homes or assault victims in dark alleys, but those who use telephone wires to reach into people's hearts and turn their deepest loves into instruments of their own destruction. Frank Morrison continues to patrol Southeast Texas, carrying with him the knowledge that somewhere in some anonymous call center, in some distant country, criminals are still making phone calls to elderly Americans, still pretending to be grandchildren in crisis, still using love as a weapon to destroy the people who care most about family. The phones keep ringing, the voices keep pleading, and the victims keep dying, one grandmother at a time. The heat shimmer rose from the asphalt of Farm Road 1696 like ghostly spirits dancing in the oppressive August sun as Texas State Trooper Walter Jenkins received the call that would introduce him to a level of criminal sophistication that challenged everything he thought he knew about rural crime in the small farming communities scattered across the vast emptiness of West Texas. It was 3:17 p.m. on a Thursday when dispatch requested him to respond to 4829 County Road 47, where an elderly farmer had apparently suffered a fatal heart attack during what neighbors described as an increasingly agitated phone conversation about unpaid taxes and federal agents who were supposedly en route to his property to seize his assets. County Road 47 stretched through cotton fields that extended to the horizon, broken only by the occasional oil derrick or abandoned farmhouse that served as monuments to families who had worked this harsh land for generations before. Economic pressures or failing health forced them to abandon their dreams of agricultural independence. The road itself was a narrow ribbon of cracked asphalt that had been patched repeatedly over the decades, creating a surface that resembled a quilt made of tar and good intentions. Earl Hartwell, 71 years old, had farmed this land for over 40 years, raising cotton, wheat, and cattle on 847 acres that had been in his family for 3 generations. His property represented the kind of agricultural heritage that defined rural Texas, a working farm that supported not just his family, but also provided employment for seasonal workers and business for local equipment dealers, feed stores, and other agricultural service providers that formed the economic backbone of small farming communities. Walter found Earl's body in his kitchen, slumped over a table covered with tax documents, bank statements, and handwritten notes that detailed a complex federal tax investigation that had supposedly been ongoing for several months. The phone was still active, connected to what appeared to be an Internal Revenue Service office, where agents were allegedly coordinating the immediate seizure of Earl's property to satisfy unpaid taxes that totaled over $187,000, including penalties and interest that had accumulated due to his failure to respond to previous notices. The crime scene told a story that would soon become depressingly familiar to Walter as he investigated similar cases throughout his patrol area. Earl had been on the phone for over 6 hours, during which he had been subjected to increasingly aggressive demands for immediate payment of taxes that the caller claimed were overdue and subject to criminal penalties that could result in year imprisonment and the complete forfeit of his property, equipment, and livestock. Earl's handwritten notes revealed the psychological torture he had endured during the final hours of his life, as IRS impersonators used fear, intimidation, and time pressure to extract back. The phone conversation had begun innocuously, with the caller identifying himself as Agent Donald Parker from the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, explaining that Earl's tax returns for the previous 3 years had been flagged for inconsistencies that suggested either deliberate tax evasion or the involvement of his accountant in a broader fraud scheme that was currently under federal investigation. The caller's knowledge of specific details from Earl's tax returns lent credibility to his claims and established the foundation for increasingly demanding requests for cooperation. Agent Parker had explained that Earl could avoid criminal prosecution and property seizure by immediately resolving the tax discrepancies through wired transfers to a special federal account that was monitored by the Treasury Department for compliance verification. The urgency was created by claims that federal agents were already en route to Earl's property and would arrive within hours to begin the asset forfeit. process unless the tax issues were resolved, immediately through full payment and penalty assessments. Earl's bank records showed that he had wired $73,000 to various accounts during the 6-hour phone conversation, representing the majority of his operating capital and savings that he had planned to use for next year's planting season. The transfers had been made to accounts that were immediately closed after receiving the funds, which were then forwarded through a complex money laundering network that made recovery virtually impossible and prosecution extremely difficult due to the international scope of the operation. But the most chilling aspect of the case was the realization that Earl had died. Believing he was cooperating with federal agents to avoid criminal prosecution, never knowing that he was actually being victimized by criminals who had researched his tax situation and used his fear of government authority as a weapon against him. His heart attack had occurred while he was still on the phone with the scammers who had continued their fraud operation even after he stopped responding to their increasingly urgent demands for additional payments. The investigation revealed that Earl's case was part of a sophisticated operation that combined elements of tax fraud, identity theft, and psychological manipulation to target rural Americans who were particularly vulnerable to official-sounding threats from supposed government agencies. The scammers had used Earl's legitimate concerns about tax compliance and his respect for federal authority to create a scenario that seemed both plausible and terrifying, forcing him to make increasingly desperate financial decisions under extreme time pressure. Walter's investigation into Earl's death led him into the complex world of IRS impersonation scams, where criminal organizations used publicly available tax information and sophisticated social engineering techniques to create convincing scenarios that exploited victims' fear of federal tax authorities. The scammers had accessed enough information about Earl's tax situation to make their claims seem legitimate, including details about his property assessments, previous tax filings, and banking relationships that would have been difficult for non-government entities to obtain through legal channels. Working with federal investigators, Walter learned that the IRS impersonation operation responsible for Earl's death was part of a larger criminal enterprise that had targeted hundreds of rural Americans across the Southwest, using similar techniques to extract millions of dollars from victims who believed they were avoiding criminal prosecution by cooperating with federal tax investigations. The operation was based in multiple countries and used sophisticated voice over internet protocol technology to disguise the actual locations of the call centers. The psychological manipulation techniques used in Earl's case were specifically designed to exploit the fears and vulnerabilities of rural Americans who had limited experience with federal tax investigations but maintained deep-seated respect for government authority. The scammers had used time pressure, fear of imprisonment, and threats of property seizure to prevent Earl from seeking advice from his accountant or attorney, who might have recognized the fraudulent nature of the demands being made. 3 weeks after Earl's death, Walter responded to another emergency call at 2156 Ranch Road 23, where 68-year-old Gary Middleton was found dead in his home office, having suffered a fatal stroke while arguing with IRS impersonators who were demanding immediate payment of back taxes allegedly owed on his cattle operation. Gary's case showed identical patterns to Earl's death, including the 6-hour phone conversation, the wire transfers to fraudulent government accounts, and the fatal medical event that occurred while the victim was still trying to comply with the scammers' demands. Gary's handwritten notes revealed that the fake IRS agents had claimed his cattle operation was under investigation for tax evasion and money laundering, with threats that his livestock would be immediately seized and his property confiscated unless he could prove his innocence by paying the back taxes and penalties that had allegedly accumulated over several years. The scammers had used Gary's legitimate concerns about agricultural tax compliance to create a scenario that seemed both urgent and unavoidable. The investigation into Gary's death revealed that the scammers had conducted extensive research into his business operations, including details about his cattle inventory, feed purchases, equipment financing, and seasonal income patterns that would have been available through agricultural databases and public records. This information had been used to create a convincing tax investigation scenario that exploited Gary's knowledge that cattle operations were indeed subject to complex federal tax regulations and frequent IRS scrutiny. Gary had wired over $89,000 to the scammers during the fatal phone conversation, liquidating business accounts and borrowing against his cattle inventory to generate the funds they claimed were needed to avoid criminal prosecution and property seizure. The transfers had been made to accounts that appeared to belong to the Treasury Department, but were actually controlled by the criminal organization responsible for the fraud operation. The pattern continued with disturbing regularity throughout Walter's patrol area as rural residents fell victim to increasingly sophisticated IRS impersonation scams that used their respect for federal authority and their fear of government persecution to extract life savings and business capital through carefully orchestrated psychological manipulation. Each case showed the same tragic elements: isolation, intimidation, financial devastation, and death that occurred while victims believed they were cooperating with legitimate federal investigations. Walter's investigation into the death of 74-year-old Arthur Kowalski revealed the most sophisticated IRS impersonation operation he had yet encountered. Arthur had been contacted by scammers claiming to be from the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, who informed him that his name had appeared on a list of individuals involved in a tax evasion scheme connected to oil and gas investments that were being used to launder money for drug cartels operating along the Mexican border. The fake investigators had provided Arthur with what appeared to be official IRS documentation, including case numbers, agent identification codes, and detailed financial reports that seemed to connect his legitimate oil and gas investments to a broader criminal conspiracy. The documentation had been sophisticated, enough to convince Arthur that he was indeed under federal investigation and needed to cooperate fully to avoid being prosecuted as a co-conspirator in the alleged money laundering operation. Arthur's phone record showed he had been in contact with the fake IRS agents for over 2 weeks, during which they had gradually increased the pressure for immediate financial cooperation, while providing increasingly detailed information about the supposed criminal investigation. The scammers had used Arthur's legitimate oil and gas investments as the foundation for a complex narrative that portrayed him as an unwitting participant in a criminal conspiracy that could result in decades of imprisonment unless he could prove his innocence. Through full cooperation and immediate payment of back taxes and penalties, the final phone conversation had lasted over 8 hours, during which Arthur had been subjected to increasingly aggressive demands for wire transfers to accounts that the scammers claimed were monitored by federal agencies for compliance verification. Arthur had wired over 100. The investigation into Arthur's case revealed that the scammers had used sophisticated data mining techniques to identify individuals with oil and gas investments that could serve as the foundation for convincing tax evasion scenarios. They had accessed public records, investment databases, and social media information to create detailed profiles of potential victims, then crafted personalized fraud scenarios that exploited each victim's specific financial situation and psychological vulnerabilities. Walter's investigation expanded when he discovered that similar IRS impersonation deaths were occurring throughout rural Texas with a pattern that suggested coordinated operations targeting residents of farming and ranching communities where limited access to professional tax advice made victims more susceptible to official-sounding threats from supposed government agencies. The scammers appeared to be working from databases of rural Americans with substantial assets that could be accessed through electronic transfers. The sophistication of these operations became even more apparent when Walter investigated the death of 66-year-old Roger Watson, who had been found dead in his barn, having hanged himself after being convinced by IRS impersonators that he faced decades in federal prison for tax evasion unless he could generate over $200,000 in immediate payments to resolve his alleged tax debt. Roger's suicide note indicated that he believed death was preferable to the disgrace and imprisonment that the scammers had convinced him were inevitable consequences of his supposed tax violations. Roger's case revealed that the IRS impersonation operation had evolved beyond simple financial fraud to include psychological warfare tactics designed to drive victims to suicide rather than face the consequences of their alleged tax violations. The scammers had used Rogers' pride in his family name and his fear of public disgrace to convince him that his tax problems would destroy his family's reputation and result in the loss of property that had been in his family for generations. The fake IRS agents had provided Roger with detailed scenarios describing how his arrest and prosecution would be covered by local media, how his property would be seized and sold at public auction, and how his family members would be investigated as potential co-conspirators in his tax evasion scheme. These psychological manipulation techniques had been designed to maximize Roger's despair and convince him that cooperation with the scammers was his only hope of protecting his family from the consequences of his supposed crimes. Roger had liquidated over $150,000 in assets during the weeks preceding his death, transferring the funds to accounts that the scammers claimed were monitored by federal agencies for tax compliance verification. But when the scammers demanded additional payments that exceeded Roger's ability to generate funds, they had shifted their tactics to psychological torture, convincing him that his failure to fully cooperate would result in even more severe consequences for his family members. The investigation into Roger's death revealed that the IRS impersonation operation was using suicide as a tool for eliminating witnesses who might eventually recognize the fraudulent nature of the tax investigations and report the crimes to law enforcement agencies. The scammers appeared to prefer victim deaths to the risk of prosecution that might result from survivors who realized they had been defrauded and sought legal recourse. Walter's reports on IRS impersonation deaths began attracting attention from federal agencies investigating organized fraud, operations that specifically targeted rural Americans through their respect for government authority and their isolation from professional financial services that might have helped them recognize the fraudulent nature of the tax investigations. The international scope and technological sophistication of these criminal networks made prosecution difficult and prevention nearly impossible. Working with federal investigators, Walter learned that the IRS impersonation operations responsible for these deaths were part of larger criminal enterprises that generated hundreds of millions of dollars annually through telephone fraud, targeting Americans who were vulnerable to official-sounding threats from supposed government agencies. The operations typically used sophisticated research techniques to identify potential victims with substantial assets and limited access to professional tax advice. The automated systems used by these operations were designed to maintain psychological pressure on victims for extended periods using recorded messages and interactive response systems that could simulate ongoing federal investigations, even when the actual scammers were not actively monitoring the calls. This technological persistence meant that victims could be subjected to continuous psychological manipulation for days or weeks without requiring constant human attention from the criminal operators. The psychological profiles developed for these cases showed that the scammers specifically targeted rural Americans who combined substantial assets with limited experience dealing with federal agencies, creating ideal conditions for fraud operations that relied on victims' respect for government authority and their fear of criminal prosecution. The isolation of rural communities made it less likely that victims would seek advice from others who might have recognized the fraudulent nature of the supposed tax investigations. The investigation took a disturbing turn when Walter discovered the death of 72-year-old Raymond Foster, found in his home office with multiple gunshot wounds that appeared to be self-inflicted after a 10-hour phone conversation with IRS impersonators who had convinced him that federal agents were en route to arrest him for tax evasion and conspiracy charges that would result in life imprisonment. Raymond's suicide note indicated that he believed death was his only escape from the disgrace and prosecution that the scammers had convinced him were inevitable. Raymond's case revealed that the IRS impersonation operation had begun targeting victims with military backgrounds, using their respect for federal authority and their fear of dishonoring their service records to create particularly effective psychological manipulation scenarios. The fake IRS agents had claimed that Raymond's disability payments and veteran benefits were connected to a broader fraud scheme involving falsified military records and stolen government funds. The scammers had used Raymond's pride in his military service to convince him that his arrest would not only result in criminal prosecution, but would also bring shame to his unit and fellow veterans who had served with him during his deployment in Vietnam. They had threatened to publicize his supposed crimes in military publications and veteran organizations, creating a scenario where death seemed preferable to the public humiliation that would result from his exposure as a tax evader and military fraudster. Raymond had transferred over $93,000 to the scammers during the weeks preceding his death, liquidating retirement accounts and borrowing against his property to generate the funds they claimed were needed to resolve his tax debt before federal agents arrived to arrest him. The transfers had been made under increasingly urgent time pressure, with the scammers claiming that each delay increased the severity of the charges he would face and the likelihood that his military records would be permanently tarnished by his prosecution. The investigation into Raymond's death revealed that the scammers had accessed military personnel databases to identify veterans with substantial assets and disability payments that could serve as the foundation for convincing tax fraud scenarios. They had used publicly available information about military units, deployment histories, and veteran benefit programs to create detailed narratives that portrayed their victims as participants in complex fraud schemes involving government benefits and military contractor payments. The sophistication of the operation became even more apparent when Walter investigated the death of 69-year-old Donald Mitchell, who had been found in his pickup truck in a remote pasture, having died from carbon monoxide poisoning after connecting a hose from his exhaust pipe to the interior of the vehicle while still on the phone with IRS impersonator. The fake investigators had provided Donald with what appeared to be official documentation, showing that his cattle sales had been flagged by multiple federal agencies as suspicious financial transactions that matched patterns associated with known money laundering operations. They had claimed that his failure to report these transactions properly had made him a co-conspirator in the drug trafficking scheme and subject to prosecution under federal racketeering laws that carried mandatory prison sentences. Donald had been convinced that his death would be less shameful for his family than the public. Exposure and criminal prosecution that the scammers had threatened would result from his involvement in the supposed money laundering operation. His suicide note indicated that he believed his death would prevent federal agents from seizing his ranch and prosecuting his family members as potential co-conspirators in the drug trafficking scheme. The investigation revealed that Donald had wired over $167,000 to the scammers during the 3-week period, representing the majority of his operating capital and savings that he had accumulated over decades of successful ranching. The funds had been transferred to accounts that appeared to belong to federal agencies, but were actually controlled by the criminal organization responsible for the sophisticated fraud operation. Walter's investigation expanded to include the death of 75-year-old Ralph Harrison, who had suffered a fatal heart attack while attempting to gather documents requested by IRS impersonators who claimed his farm equipment purchases were connected to a tax evasion scheme involving falsified depreciation claims and fraudulent business expenses. Ralph had been found in his barn, collapsed among scattered financial records that he had been organizing in response to the scammers' demands for documentation to support his supposed defense against federal tax charges. Ralph's case revealed that the IRS impersonation operation had begun using victims' own financial records against them, claiming that legitimate business expenses and equipment purchases showed patterns that indicated systematic tax fraud. The scammers had used Ralph's detailed record-keeping and his legitimate efforts to maximize his tax deductions to create a narrative that portrayed his careful financial management as evidence of criminal intent to defraud the government. The fake IRS agents had claimed that Ralph's depreciation schedules for farm equipment showed impossible patterns that could only have been created through deliberate falsification of purchase dates and equipment values. They had used his legitimate confusion about complex agricultural tax regulations to convince him that his honest mistakes in calculating depreciation had been interpreted by federal investigators as evidence of systematic fraud that warranted criminal prosecution. Ralph had spent his final hours attempting to organize financial records that would prove his innocence to the supposed federal investigators. But the stress and physical exertion of searching through decades of farm records had triggered the heart attack that killed him, while he was still trying to demonstrate that his tax filings had been honest and accurate. The investigation into Ralph's death revealed that the scammers had used agricultural tax databases and equipment financing records to identify farmers with substantial equipment investments that could serve as the foundation for convincing tax fraud scenarios. They had accessed information about depreciation schedules, equipment values, and financing arrangements to create detailed accusations that would be difficult for victims to immediately disprove without extensive documentation. The psychological warfare tactics used in these cases were designed to exploit the pride and integrity that rural Americans typically associated with honest business practices and accurate tax compliance. The scammers had turned victims' own honesty and attention to detail into weapons against them, using their legitimate efforts to follow tax regulations as evidence that they were actually engaged in sophisticated fraud schemes. Walter's patrol area had become a killing field for IRS impersonation scams that were systematically targeting rural Americans through their respect for the federal authority and their fear of government persecution. The crimes were particularly cruel because they used victims' own integrity and law-abiding nature as the mechanisms of their destruction, convincing honest citizens that their efforts to comply with tax regulations were actually evidence of criminal intent. The investigation revealed that the IRS impersonation operation was part of a larger criminal enterprise that had identified rural Americans as particularly vulnerable to telephone fraud involving government authority figures. The combination of substantial assets, limited access to professional advice, and deep respect for federal agencies created ideal conditions for fraud operations that could extract large sums of money while maintaining psychological control over victims for extended periods. Federal investigators working with Walter discovered that similar IRS impersonation deaths were occurring throughout rural America, with a pattern that suggested coordinated operations targeting agricultural communities where victims were isolated from the professional services and social support systems that might have helped them recognize the fraudulent nature of the supposed tax investigations. The technological sophistication of these operations was evident in their ability to maintain consistent narratives across multiple phone calls while accessing real-time information about victims' financial situations and tax obligations. The scammers used voice-over internet protocol technology, automated response systems, and sophisticated data mining techniques to create convincing federal investigation scenarios that could be sustained for weeks or months without detection. The automation aspect of these operations was particularly disturbing, as Walter discovered when he found that many victims had died while still connected to systems that continued playing recordings of supposed federal agents making threats and demands even after the victims had stopped responding. The technological persistence of these systems meant that evidence of the psychological torture remained active when law enforcement arrived at crime scenes. Walter's reports on IRS impersonation deaths attracted the attention of congressional investigators who were examining the adequacy of federal responses to telephone fraud operations that specifically targeted rural Americans. The cases highlighted the vulnerability of agricultural communities to sophisticated fraud operations that exploited their isolation and their respect for government authority. The emotional toll on Walter was severe as he struggled to understand how criminals could systematically exploit patriotism and respect for law enforcement to commit murder through psychological manipulation. His investigation had revealed that rural Americans' best qualities, their integrity, their respect for authority, and their commitment to following the law had been weaponized against them by criminals who felt no remorse for destroying lives through carefully crafted lies about federal tax investigations. Today, the farms and ranches where these deaths occurred continue to operate under new ownership or have been abandoned entirely, their owners having died believing they were criminals who deserved punishment for tax violations that existed only in the imagination of telephone fraudsters. Walter continues to patrol rural West Texas, carrying with him the knowledge that somewhere in anonymous call centers around the world, criminals are still making phone calls to rural Americans, still pretending to be federal agents investigating tax violations, still using respect for government authority as a weapon to destroy the people who care most about following the law. The investigation files on these IRS impersonation deaths remain open, though no arrests have been made and no recovery of stolen funds has been achieved. The cases serve as a haunting reminder that in an era of sophisticated international crime, the most dangerous predators are those who understand how to exploit the trust and integrity that form the foundation of rural American communities. The farms stand empty now. Their owners having paid the ultimate price for believing that cooperation with supposed federal authorities was more important than protecting themselves from strangers who used official-sounding titles and government agency names to commit murder by telephone. The taxmen came calling, but they were never real. And by the time their victims realized the truth, it was already too late to save themselves from the financial and psychological warfare that had turned their own honesty into the instrument of their destruction. The scorching September heat had already driven most sensible people indoors by the time Texas State Trooper Earl Davidson received the dispatch that would introduce him to a predator who used the promise of safety and security as bait for the most vulnerable residents of the small East Texas towns scattered like forgotten coins across the Piney Woods region. It was 4:23 p.m. when the call came through his radio requesting him to respond to 627 Magnolia Street in the town of Jefferson, population 2,16, where an elderly resident had been found dead under circumstances that the local medical examiner described as suspicious, but not immediately explainable. Jefferson was one of those small Texas towns that seemed suspended in time, where antebellum mansions lined trees-shaded streets, and tourists came to ride steamboats on Big Cypress Bayou, while imagining what life had been like when the town served as a major river port connecting East Texas to markets in New Orleans and beyond. But beneath the carefully maintained historical facade, Jefferson struggled with the same problems that plagued many small southern towns. An aging population, limited economic opportunities, and the isolation that made residents vulnerable to predators who understood how to exploit trust and community connections for criminal purposes. The house at 627 Magnolia Street was a modest Victorian cottage painted white with green trim, surrounded by a garden that showed the careful attention of someone who took pride in maintaining their property despite the challenges of age and limited mobility. The front porch contained 2 rocking chairs positioned to overlook the street, suggesting that the resident had enjoyed watching neighborhood activities and maintaining the informal social connections that characterized small-town life in East Texas. Earl found Dorothy Patterson, 79 years old, in her living room, seated in her favorite armchair with a cup of cold coffee on the table beside her and a stack of home security brochures spread across her lap. At first glance, she appeared to be napping, but closer inspection revealed that she had been dead for several days, apparently having suffered a heart attack while reviewing information about security systems that she had been considering for her home. The crime scene told a story that would become increasingly familiar to Earl as he investigated similar cases throughout his patrol area. Dorothy's living room contained evidence of recent visits from door-to-door salespeople who had been marketing sophisticated home security systems to elderly residents, using fear of crime and promises of safety to extract substantial upfront payments for equipment and services that were either never installed or functioned poorly when they were actually provided. The security brochures found in Dorothy's lap detailed an elaborate system that promised comprehensive protection against burglary, home invasion, medical emergencies, and fire hazards through a combination of sensors, cameras, monitoring services, and direct connections to local law enforcement and emergency medical services. The system was marketed as essential protection for elderly residents living alone, particularly those in neighborhoods where crime rates had allegedly increased dramatically in recent years. But what made Dorothy's case particularly disturbing was the evidence that she had been systematically terrorized by the security salespeople in the weeks preceding her death. Subjected to increasingly frightening scenarios about crime trends in her neighborhood and her personal vulnerability as an elderly woman living alone in a house that lacked modern security features, the psychological manipulation had been designed to create maximum fear and urgency while preventing Dorothy from seeking advice from family members or community leaders who might have recognized the fraudulent nature of the security operation. Earl's investigation revealed that Dorothy had paid over $15,000 for a security system that was never properly installed. Despite multiple visits from technicians who claimed to be setting up the equipment and testing the various components of the comprehensive protection package she had purchased, the payments had been made through a combination of check, credit card, and cash transactions that had been structured to avoid triggering banking regulations designed to identify suspicious financial activity. The investigation led Earl into the dark world of door-to-door home security scams, where criminal organizations used sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques to target elderly residents who were isolated from family support systems and community connections that might have protected them from predatory sales practices. The scammers had researched Dorothy's living situation, her financial resources, and her family relationships to create a personalized fear campaign that exploited her specific vulnerabilities and concerns. Working with federal investigators, Earl learned that Dorothy's case was part of a larger operation that had been targeting elderly residents across East Texas, using similar techniques to extract hundreds of thousands of dollars from victims who believed they were purchasing protection from crime, but were actually being victimized by the very people who claimed to be keeping them safe. The operation involved multiple individuals who played different roles in the elaborate fraud scheme. The initial contact had been made by a man calling himself Donald Richardson, who claimed to be a security consultant conducting a neighborhood safety assessment for the local police department. Richardson had visited Dorothy's home wearing what appeared to be official identification and carrying professional-look materials that detailed recent crime trends in her area, including specific incidents that had allegedly occurred on her street or in her immediate neighborhood. Richardson's presentation had been designed to create maximum anxiety about Dorothy's personal safety while establishing his credibility as someone who was working with law enforcement to address growing crime problems in the area. He had used actual crime statistics from other parts of East Texas to create a false impression that Dorothy's neighborhood was experiencing a dramatic increase in burglaries, home invasions, and attacks on elderly residents living alone. The second phase of the operation had involved a series of follow-up visits by technicians who claimed to be conducting security assessments and installing equipment that would provide comprehensive protection against the various threats that Richardson had identified. These individuals had used Dorothy's growing fear and her trust in Richardson's authority to gain regular access to her home while gradually increasing the complexity and cost of the security system they claimed was necessary for her protection. The psychological manipulation techniques used in Dorothy's case were sophisticated and cruel, designed to create a state of constant anxiety and dependence on the security salespeople, who positioned themselves as Dorothy's only reliable source of protection against the dangers they had convinced her. Earl's investigation revealed that the door-to-door security scam operation had been active in East Texas for over 2 years, targeting elderly residents in small towns where limited law enforcement resources made detection and investigation more difficult. The scammers had developed detailed profiles of potential victims using public records, social media information, and community observations to identify individuals who were particularly vulnerable to fear-based sales techniques. The operation had been structured to avoid detection by law enforcement agencies that might investigate individual cases, but would be less likely to recognize patterns that extended across multiple jurisdictions and involved sophisticated coordination between different team members who played specific roles in the elaborate fraud scheme. The scammers had used legitimate security equipment and professional-looking documentation to create an appearance of legitimacy that could withstand casual scrutiny from victims or their family members. 2 weeks after Dorothy's death, Earl responded to another emergency call at 1534 Pine Street, where 82-year-old Arthur Kowalski had been found dead in his kitchen, having suffered a fatal stroke while attempting to gather additional funds requested by security salespeople who claimed that recent break-ins in his neighborhood required immediate upgrades to the system they had previously installed in his home. Arthur's case revealed that the door-to-door security scam operation had evolved to include ongoing exploitation of previous victims through claims that their security systems required expensive upgrades or additional components to address new threats that had developed since the original installation. The scammers had used Arthur's trust in their previous work and his growing fear of crime to extract additional payments for equipment and services that were never actually provided. The investigation into Arthur's death showed that he had paid over $23,000 for security system installations and upgrades over the course of 8 months, representing the majority of his fixed income and savings that he had accumulated during decades of work as a mechanic and small business owner. The payments had been extracted through a series of increasingly urgent requests for additional funds to address security threats that the scammers claimed were specific to his property and personal situation. Arthur's handwritten notes found scattered around his kitchen documented the fear and confusion he had experienced as the security salespeople continued to identify new vulnerabilities and security gaps that required immediate attention and additional financial investment. The notes revealed that Arthur had been convinced that his previous security installations were inadequate to address evolving criminal techniques, and that failure to upgrade his system would leave him completely defenseless against burglars who had allegedly been targeting homes in his neighborhood. The scammers had used Arthur's previous payments as evidence that he understood the importance of security and was committed to protecting himself from the various threats they had identified. They had positioned additional purchases as logical extensions of his existing security investment rather than separate transactions, making it easier for Arthur to justify the continuing financial commitments they requested. The pattern continued with disturbing regularity throughout Earl's patrol area, as elderly residents fell victim to increasingly sophisticated door-to-door security scams that used their natural concerns about safety and their isolation from family support systems to extract life savings through carefully orchestrated fear campaigns. Each case showed the same tragic elements: isolation, manipulation, financial exploitation, and medical emergencies that occurred while victims were trying to generate additional funds for security systems that provided no actual protection. Earl's investigation into the death of 73-year-old Gary Morrison revealed the most sophisticated door-to-door security operation he had yet encountered. Gary had been contacted by scammers claiming to represent a security company that was working with local law enforcement to install advanced monitoring systems in the homes of elderly residents who'd been identified as potential targets for a criminal organization that specialized in robbing and assaulting senior citizens. The fake security representatives had provided Gary with what appeared to be official law enforcement documentation, including incident reports, criminal profiles, and strategic plans that seemed to connect his home to a broader crime prevention initiative being coordinated by multiple agencies. The documentation had been sophisticated enough to convince Gary that he was indeed at risk and needed to cooperate with the security installation to protect both himself and the broader law enforcement operation. Gary's phone records showed he had been in regular contact with the fake security representatives for over 6 weeks, during which they had gradually increased the complexity and cost of the security system while providing detailed updates about the criminal organization that was allegedly targeting elderly residents in his area. The scammers had used Gary's patriotic desire to cooperate with law enforcement to extract over $31,000 for security equipment and monitoring services that were never actually provided. The investigation into Gary's death revealed that the scammers had used sophisticated research techniques to identify elderly residents with military backgrounds who would be particularly responsive to official sounding requests for cooperation with law enforcement activities. They had used Gary's respect for authority and his desire to protect his community to create a scenario where purchasing their security system seemed like both a personal necessity and a civic duty. The final phase of Gary's victimization had involved claims that the criminal organization was specifically targeting homes with partial security installations, making it essential for him to complete the full system installation immediately to avoid becoming a priority target for criminals who were looking for homes with incomplete or inadequate security measures. Gary had suffered his fatal heart attack while attempting to gather additional funds for the final phase of the security installation that the scammers claimed was necessary to protect his life. Earl's investigation expanded when he discovered that similar door-to-door security scam deaths were occurring throughout East Texas, with a pattern that suggested coordinated operations targeting elderly residents in small towns where limited access to consumer protection services made victims more susceptible to sophisticated fraud schemes involving home security products and services. The sophistication of these operations became even more apparent when Earl investigated the death of 71-year-old Roger Watson, who had been found in his garage having suffered carbon monoxide poisoning while running his car engine to power a portable heater that security salespeople had convinced him to use while they conducted overnight testing of motion sensors that had allegedly been installed throughout his property. Roger's case revealed that the door-to-door security scam operation had evolved to include elaborate installation procedures that required victims to modify their daily routines and living arrangements to accommodate the supposed security equipment being installed in their homes. The scammers had used these procedures to maintain continuous contact with their victims while creating opportunities for additional exploitation and financial extraction. The investigation revealed that Roger had been convinced that proper testing of his security system required him to simulate normal daily activities, while technicians monitored the sensors and cameras from various locations throughout his property. The testing procedures had been designed to be uncomfortable and disruptive, creating conditions where victims would be eager to complete the installation process as quickly as possible without questioning the legitimacy of the equipment or services being provided. Roger had paid over $19,000 for a security system that existed primarily in the form of non-functional props that had been strategically placed throughout his home to create the appearance of a comprehensive installation while providing no actual security benefits. The fake equipment had been sophisticated enough to pass casual inspection, but was designed primarily for psychological manipulation rather than functional security monitoring. The psychological warfare tactics used in these cases were designed to exploit the fear and vulnerability that many elderly Americans experienced. The investigation revealed that the door-to-door security scam operation was part of a larger criminal enterprise that had identified elderly residents of small towns as particularly vulnerable to fraud schemes involving home security products and services. The combination of social isolation, fixed incomes that provided substantial savings, and limited access to consumer protection resources created ideal conditions for predatory sales operations that could extract large sums of money while maintaining psychological control over victims for extended periods. Federal investigators working with Earl discovered that the security scam operations responsible for these deaths were using sophisticated marketing techniques borrowed from legitimate security companies, including professional-looking brochures, official-sounding company names, and realistic equipment demonstrations that could fool even cautious consumers who were trying to make informed decisions about home security investments. The automation aspect of these operations was evident in their ability to maintain consistent narratives across multiple visits while adapting their sales techniques to each victim's specific concerns and financial situation. The scammers used detailed victim profiles, scripted presentation materials, and coordinated team approaches to create convincing security installation scenarios that could be sustained for months without detection. Earl's reports on door-to-door security scam deaths attracted attention from state consumer protection agencies that were investigating the adequacy of existing regulations governing door-to-door sales practices, particularly those targeting elderly residents who might be vulnerable to high-pressure sales techniques and misleading product claims. The emotional toll on Earl was severe as he realized that his traditional law enforcement training had not prepared him to deal with crimes that used the promise of safety and security as weapons against vulnerable victims who were seeking protection from the very dangers that their attackers had convinced them were threatening their lives. Today, the small towns of East Texas continue to struggle with the legacy of these door-to-door security scams, as elderly residents who survived similar victimization remain fearful of legitimate security companies while being hesitant to invest in actual security measures that might provide real protection against crime. Earl continues to patrol the region, carrying with him the knowledge that somewhere sophisticated criminals are still going door-to-door in small communities, still promising safety to elderly residents who want nothing more than to feel secure in their own homes. The investigation files on these door-to-door security scam deaths remain open, serving as a reminder that the promise of safety can become the most dangerous threat of all when it comes from predators who understand how to exploit fear and vulnerability for profit. The security systems were never real, but the fear they created was genuine. And by the time victims realized they had been deceived, they had already paid the ultimate price for believing that strangers who knocked on their doors actually cared about keeping them safe. The afternoon sun blazed mercilessly across the cracked parking lot of the Sunset Manor Assisted Living Facility in Beaumont, Texas, as State Trooper Donald Richards received what would initially seem like a routine call about a suspicious death at the facility. It was 2:45 p.m. on a sweltering Thursday in July when dispatch informed him that an 84-year-old resident had been found dead in her room under circumstances that the facility administrator described as concerning but not immediately explainable. The heat index had reached 108 degrees, and even the hardiest East Texas natives were seeking shelter in air-conditioned buildings, making the timing of the death seem consistent with the kind of heat-related medical emergencies that were unfortunately common among elderly residents during brutal summer months. Sunset Manor occupied a converted 1960s motel on the outskirts of Beaumont, where the smell of petroleum refineries mixed with the humidity rolling in from the Gulf of Mexico to create an atmosphere that was both oppressive and somehow distinctly Texan. The facility served as home to 47 elderly residents who could no longer live independently, but whose families couldn't afford the luxury of more expensive care facilities in the area. It was a place where people came to wait, surrounded by others who understood that their best years were behind them, and their remaining time was measured in gradual decline rather than hopeful possibilities. The victim, Margaret Wheeler, had been a resident of Sunset Manor for 3 years, ever since her daughter Joyce had reluctantly admitted that her mother could no longer safely live alone in the house where she had raised her family and maintained her independence for over 4 decades. Margaret's room was small but personalized, with photographs of grandchildren, needlework projects that she completed despite arthritic hands, and a collection of romance novels that she read voraciously despite failing eyesight that required increasingly strong magnification glasses. Donald found Margaret in her reclining chair, positioned near the window where she enjoyed watching traffic on the busy highway that connected Beaumont to the smaller communities scattered throughout southeast Texas. She appeared peaceful, but the room contained evidence that her final hours had been filled with excitement and activity that seemed inconsistent with her typically quiet routine at the assisted living facility. The crime scene told a story that would soon become familiar to Donald as he investigated similar cases throughout his patrol area. Margaret's bedside table was covered with lottery tickets, sweepstakes entry forms, and congratulatory letters informing her that she had won substantial cash prizes that required only modest processing fees and tax payments before the winnings could be distributed. The material suggested that Margaret had been participating in multiple lottery and sweepstakes contests, believing that she was on the verge of receiving millions of dollars in prize money that would transform her final years from a period of gradual decline into a time of unprecedented wealth and opportunity. But what made Margaret's case particularly disturbing was the evidence that she had been systematically exploited by sophisticated fraud operations that used her isolation, her limited income, and her desperate desire for financial security to extract thousands of dollars through carefully orchestrated lottery and sweepstakes scams that preyed on elderly too, victims who were vulnerable to promises of sudden wealth that could solve all their problems and provide financial security for their families. Donald's investigation revealed that Margaret had been receiving daily phone calls and mail deliveries from organizations claiming to represent various national and international lottery systems, all of which informed her that she had been selected as a winner in contests that she had never entered, but that had somehow identified her as deserving of substantial financial rewards. The communications had been designed to create maximum excitement and urgency while requiring immediate payments for processing fees, tax obligations, and administrative costs that were supposedly necessary before her winnings could be distributed. The phone records showed that Margaret had been in contact with lottery representatives for over 8 months, during which she had been subjected to increasingly elaborate scenarios involving multiple prize awards, bonus winnings, and special promotions that required additional payments, but promised even larger financial rewards. The scammers had used Margaret's growing investment in the process to justify continued payments, convincing her that each additional fee brought her closer to receiving the millions of dollars that had been awarded to her through various lottery systems. Margaret's bank records revealed that she had withdrawn over $27,000 from her limited savings and pension accounts to pay the various fees and taxes that lottery representatives claimed were required before her winnings could be distributed. The payments had been made through wire transfers, prepaid debit cards, and cash shipments that were designed to be difficult to trace and impossible to recover, once the funds had been transferred to accounts controlled by the criminal organizations responsible for the fraud operations. But the most chilling aspect of Margaret's case was the realization that she had died believing she was about to receive millions of dollars in lottery winnings, never knowing that she was actually being systematically robbed by criminals who had researched her financial situation and psychological vulnerabilities to create a personalized fraud scenario that exploited her dreams of financial security and her desire to leave something substantial to her family. The investigation led Donald into the complex world of lottery, and the scammers had accessed information about Margaret's living situation, her financial resources, and her family relationships to create a convincing lottery scenario that seemed both legitimate and personally meaningful. Working with federal investigators, Donald learned that Margaret's case was part of a larger operation that had targeted hundreds of elderly residents and assisted living facilities across the Southeast, using similar techniques to extract millions of dollars from victims who believed they were claiming legitimate lottery prizes, but were actually being victimized by sophisticated fraud networks that specialized in exploiting the hopes and dreams of America's most vulnerable citizens. The initial contact had been made through a series of official-looking mailings that informed Margaret she had been selected as a potential winner in the International Senior Citizens Sweepstakes, a supposedly legitimate contest that awarded substantial cash prizes to deserving elderly Americans who had been identified through demographic research as examples of hard work, family values, and community service. The mailings had included personalized information about Margaret's background and living situation that lent credibility to claims that she had been specifically chosen for this honor. The psychological manipulation techniques used in Margaret's case were designed to create a sense of excitement and anticipation while gradually increasing her financial commitment to the prize-claiming process. The scammers had used her isolation and her limited social interactions to position themselves as the primary source of good news and positive experiences in her daily life, creating a psychological dependence that made it difficult for her to question the legitimacy of their claims. The lottery representatives had called Margaret daily, providing updates on the status of her various prize awards while requesting additional payments for processing fees, insurance requirements, and tax obligations that were supposedly required by federal regulations governing large cash prize distributions. The calls had been timed to coincide with periods when Margaret was most likely to be alone and receptive to extended conversations with friendly strangers who seemed genuinely interested in her welfare and excited about her good fortune. 3 weeks. After Margaret's death, Donald responded to another emergency call at Pinewood Assisted Living, where 79-year-old Betty Henderson had been found dead in her bathroom, having apparently suffered a heart attack while gathering jewelry and personal valuables that lottery representatives had instructed her to photograph and catalogue as part of the prize verification process required before her winnings could be distributed. Betty's case revealed that the lottery fraud operation had evolved to include elaborate verification procedures that required victims to document their personal assets and provide detailed financial information that was supposedly needed to ensure their prize winnings would be distributed in compliance with federal tax regulations and money laundering prevention requirements. The verification process had been designed to extract additional information about victims' financial resources, while creating opportunities for identity theft and additional fraud. The investigation into Betty's death showed that she had been convinced that her lottery winnings were being held up by federal agencies that required proof of her identity and financial status before approving the distribution of her prize money. The scammers had used Betty's respect for federal authority and her desire to comply with all legal requirements to justify increasingly intrusive requests for personal and financial information. Betty's room contained extensive documentation of her efforts to meet the verification requirements that lottery representatives had described as essential for receiving her prize money. She had photographed her jewelry, documented her bank account balances, provided copies of her social security card and birth certificate, and even created detailed inventories of her personal possessions that the scammers claimed were needed to establish her eligibility for the maximum prize awards. The scammers had used Betty's compliance with previous verification requests to justify increasingly demanding requirements that kept her engaged in the fraud operation while extracting personal information that could be used for identity theft and additional financial exploitation. Each completed verification step had been praised as evidence of Betty's dedication to following proper procedures, while new requirements were introduced as unfortunate but necessary bureaucratic obstacles that had to be overcome before her prize money could be released. Betty had paid over $34,000 in various fees and taxes during the months preceding her death, liquidating retirement accounts and borrowing against her personal possessions to generate the funds that lottery representatives claimed were required before her winnings could be distributed. The payments had been structured to avoid triggering banking regulations, designed to identify suspicious financial activity, with the scammers providing specific instructions about how to make transfers and amounts and patterns that would appear routine to banking security systems. The pattern continued with horrifying regularity throughout Donald's patrol area, as elderly residents of assisted living facilities fell victim to increasingly sophisticated lottery and sweepstakes fraud operations that used their isolation, their limited incomes and their dreams of financial security to extract life savings through carefully orchestrated campaigns that promised wealth but delivered only exploitation and death. Donald's investigation into the death of 77-year-old Raymond Foster revealed the most elaborate lottery fraud operation he had yet encountered. Raymond had been contacted by representatives of what they claimed was the International Heritage Foundation, a supposedly legitimate organization that awarded substantial cash prizes to elderly Americans who had been identified as deserving. Recipients based on their lifetime contributions to their communities and their demonstrated need for financial assistance. The Heritage Foundation representatives had provided Raymond with detailed documentation about his selection process, including evaluation reports that praised his work history, his military service during the Korean War, and his volunteer activities at local churches and community organizations. The documentation had been sophisticated enough to convince Raymond that he had indeed been carefully evaluated and selected for recognition through a legitimate awards program. Raymond's phone records showed that he had been in contact with Foundation representatives for over 10 months, during which they had gradually revealed that his initial award of $750,000 had been increased to over $2. $3 million based on additional evaluations of his worthiness, and the Foundation's desire to provide maximum assistance to deserving recipients who had demonstrated exceptional character and community service throughout their lives. The investigation revealed that Raymond had paid over $43,000 in processing fees, charitable donations, and tax payments that Foundation representatives claimed were required before his award could be distributed. The payments had been justified as proof of his commitment to using his winnings responsibly and his willingness to contribute to charitable causes that supported other deserving elderly Americans who needed financial assistance. Raymond's final payment had been requested as an emergency processing fee needed to resolve last-minute complications that had developed when federal agencies required additional. The sophistication of these operations became even more apparent when Donald investigated the death of 81-year-old Ruth Martinez, who had been found in her room surrounded by shipping boxes that she had been preparing to send to Lottery headquarters as part of what representatives had described as the final step in claiming her prize. Winnings of over $8 million. Ruth's case revealed that the lottery fraud operation had evolved to include elaborate prize-claiming procedures that required victims to ship personal possessions, valuable items, and cash payments to various addresses that the scammers claimed were processing centers for major lottery organizations. The shipping requirements had been justified as security measures designed to prevent fraud and ensure that prize winnings were distributed only to legitimate winners who could prove their identity and commitment to following proper procedures. The boxes in Ruth's room contained jewelry, family heirlooms, and personal valuables that she had been instructed to ship to lottery headquarters as collateral for her prize winnings, with promises that the items would be returned along with her cash awards once the final verification process had been completed. Ruth had also prepared envelopes containing thousands of dollars in cash that representatives had claimed were needed for final processing fees and international shipping costs. Ruth had died while struggling to lift the heavy shipping boxes that she had been preparing to send to lottery headquarters, apparently suffering a heart attack brought on by the physical exertion and emotional stress of completing what she believed were the final requirements for claiming her prize money. Her body was found beside the boxes with shipping labels addressed to locations that investigations later revealed were mail forwarding services used by the criminal organization to collect items from their victims. The investigation revealed that Ruth had been convinced that her prize winnings were being held at secure facilities that required her to prove her identity and financial responsibility through the shipping of valuable collateral that would be returned once her eligibility had been verified. The scammers had used Ruth's limited understanding of financial security procedures to create a scenario where shipping her most valuable possessions seemed like a logical requirement for claiming her lottery prize. The cruelty of Ruth's victimization was evident in the fact that she had packed family heirlooms and irreplaceable mementos that represented her most treasured connections to deceased family members and happier times in her life. The scammers had convinced her to risk losing these irreplaceable items based on their promises that her lottery winnings would provide her with the financial resources to replace any possessions that might be lost. During the shipping process, Donald's investigation revealed that the lottery fraud operations responsible for these deaths were using sophisticated research techniques to identify elderly residents of assisted living facilities who were particularly vulnerable to promises of sudden wealth due to their isolation from family members, their limited financial resources, and their psychological need for hope and excitement in lives that had been reduced to routine medical care and institutional meals. The targeting of assisted living facility residents was particularly effective because these individuals were already experiencing the psychological trauma of having lost their independence and control over their daily lives, making them especially receptive to scenarios that promise to restore their dignity and provide them with the resources to regain some measure of control over their circumstances. Federal investigators working with Donald discovered that the lottery scam operations were using employee information and resident databases from assisted living facilities to identify potential victims and gather personal information that could be used to create convincing prize award scenarios. The data breaches that provided this information were often difficult to detect and investigate, making it nearly impossible to prevent the initial contact that began the victimization process. The automation aspects of these operations were evident in their ability to maintain consistent narratives across multiple phone calls and mail communications while adapting their fraud scenarios to each victim's specific interests and psychological vulnerabilities. The scammers used detailed victim profiles, scripted communication materials, and coordinated team approaches to create convincing lottery scenarios that could be sustained for months without detection by facility staff or family members. The investigation took a particularly disturbing turn when Donald discovered the death of 76-year-old Arthur Kowalski, who had been found in the facility parking lot, having apparently been struck by a car while attempting to meet a lottery representative who had claimed to be arriving with the partial payment of his prize winnings that required his immediate signature and verification of his identity. Arthur's case revealed that the lottery fraud operation had begun using face-to-face meetings as the final phase of their victimization process, convincing elderly victims that lottery representatives would personally deliver partial payments or verification documents that required immediate signature and additional payments before the full prize amounts could be distributed. The meetings were typically scheduled in parking lots or other locations away from facility staff who might interfere with the transaction. The investigation revealed that Arthur had been waiting in the parking lot for over 2 hours before being struck by what appeared to be a hit-and-run driver who left no evidence of their identity or connection to the supposed lottery organization. Arthur had been carrying over $8,000 in cash that he had been instructed to bring to the meeting as a final processing fee. Money that was missing from the scene when his body was discovered. The hit-and-run aspect of Arthur's death suggested that the lottery fraud operation had evolved to include physical violence as a means of eliminating witnesses who might eventually recognize the fraudulent nature of their victimization and report the crimes to law enforcement agencies. The scammers appeared to prefer victim deaths to the risk of prosecution that might result from survivors who realized they had been defrauded. Donald's reports on lottery fraud deaths began attracting attention from federal agencies investigating organized fraud, operations that specifically targeted elderly Americans through their dreams of financial security and their vulnerability to promises of sudden wealth that could solve their problems and provide dignity in their final years. The international scope and technological sophistication of these criminal networks made prosecution difficult and prevention nearly impossible. The psychological impact on Donald was severe as he realized that the lottery fraud operations were not just stealing money, but were systematically destroying the hopes and dreams that provided emotional sustenance for elderly Americans who had already lost their independence, their health, and many of their social connections. The criminals were committing murder by exploiting the very psychological mechanisms that allowed elderly people to maintain hope and meaning in circumstances that would otherwise be unbearably depressing. Working with facility administrators, Donald developed educational programs designed to help assisted living staff recognize the signs of lottery fraud victimization and intervene before elderly residents could be financially and psychologically destroyed by criminal organizations that specialized in exploiting their vulnerabilities. But the programs had limited effectiveness because many victims were embarrassed about their participation in lottery contests and reluctant to discuss their financial activities with staff members. The investigation revealed that lottery fraud operations had become a multi-billion-dollar criminal industry that systematically targeted America's most vulnerable citizens through their basic human need for. The operations were particularly cruel because they used victims' own optimism and dreams as weapons against them, turning hope into a mechanism for financial and psychological destruction. The technological sophistication of these operations was evident in their ability to generate personalized communications, maintain detailed victim databases, and coordinate complex fraud scenarios across multiple communication channels. While avoiding detection by law enforcement agencies that were not equipped to investigate crimes that combined international operations, sophisticated psychology, and advanced technology in ways that traditional investigative techniques could not address. Today, the assisted living facilities of Southeast Texas continue to house elderly residents who dream of lottery winnings that will never come, while criminals in anonymous call centers around the world continue to make phone calls promising wealth to people whose greatest crime was hoping that their final years might contain some measure of joy and financial security. Donald continues to patrol the region, carrying with him the knowledge that somewhere sophisticated fraud operations are still sending congratulatory letters to elderly Americans, still making phone calls about lottery prizes that don't exist, still using hope as a weapon to destroy the people who most desperately need something to hope for. The investigation files remain open, though no arrests have been made and no recovery of stolen funds has been achieved. The cases serve as a haunting reminder that in a world where criminals understand human psychology better than most people understand criminal behavior, the promise of dreams coming true can become the most dangerous threat of all when it comes from predators who profit from turning hope into horror. The lottery tickets found in Margaret Wheeler's room were never valid. The prize money was never real, but the hope that killed her was genuine. And somewhere in the world, the phones are still ringing with congratulations for elderly Americans who have won prizes that exist only in the imagination of criminals who have learned that dreams can be more valuable than money. When they're used as bait to catch the most vulnerable members of society, the dreams never die, but the dreamers do. One elderly American at a time, each believing until their final breath that their suffering is about to end, and their prayers are about to be answered by strangers who care nothing about their hopes and everything about their money. The lottery calls continue, the prize notifications keep coming, and the death toll keeps mounting as America's most vulnerable citizens pay the ultimate price for believing that someone somewhere actually wants to make their dreams come true. The dusty gravel of County Road 1247 crunched under the tires of Texas State Trooper Eugene Morrison's patrol car as he responded to what dispatch had described as a property dispute between neighbors in the remote hill country west of Austin, where limestone bluffs rose from cedar-choked valleys and the distance between houses could be measured in miles rather than city blocks. It was 6:34 p.m. on a scorching September evening when the call came through requesting law enforcement assistance for what the caller described as an escalating boundary dispute that had turned threatening and potentially violent. The Hill Country of Central Texas was a region where property lines mattered more than municipal ordinances, where families had maintained the same ranching operations for generations, and where disputes over water rights, mineral rights, and boundary markers could simmer for decades before exploding into violence that reflected the fierce independence and stubborn pride that characterized rural Texans who had built their lives on land that their ancestors had fought to claim and defend property at 40,847 County Road. 1247 belonged to Ralph Brennan, a 67-year-old retired petroleum engineer who had purchased 247 acres of rugged hill country terrain 5 years earlier, with plans to establish a small cattle operation that would provide him with meaningful work during his retirement years and allow him to fulfill his lifelong dream of becoming a genuine Texas rancher, rather than just someone who worked in the oil business that had dominated the states, its economy for over a century. Eugene found Ralph's property easily identifiable by the new metal gate and cattle guard that marked the entrance to his ranch, along with professionally installed fencing that ran along the county road frontage, and disappeared into the cedar breaks and limestone outcroppings that characterized the challenging terrain of this part of the hill country. The property showed signs of recent development, including a newly constructed metal barn, stock tank, and gravel roads that provided access to pastures that had been cleared of cedar and reseeded with improved grasses suitable for cattle grazing. But what Eugene discovered when he arrived at Ralph's property would challenge his understanding of rural property disputes and introduce him to a level of neighbor-to-neighbor violence that went far beyond the typical boundary disagreements that occasionally required law enforcement intervention in communities where survey markers might be decades old and property lines could be legitimately disputed due to incomplete records or natural changes in landscape features. Ralph Brennan was found in his pasture approximately 200 YD from his house with multiple gunshot wounds that appeared to have been inflicted by a high-powered rifle fired from a considerable distance. His body was positioned near a recently installed fence post that marked what appeared to be a disputed boundary between his property and the adjacent ranch owned by his neighbor Gary Patterson, who had owned and operated his family's cattle ranch for over 30 years before Ralph's arrival had disrupted the informal arrangements and traditional practices that had governed land use in the area. The crime scene told a story of escalating conflict over property boundaries that had apparently begun as a civil disagreement over survey lines and fence placement, but had gradually intensified into a deadly confrontation that reflected the deep-seated emotions and practical concerns that could make property disputes particularly volatile in rural areas where land ownership represented not just financial investment, but also personal identity and family heritage. Eugene's investigation revealed that the conflict between Ralph and Gary had been developing for over 2 years, beginning shortly after Ralph had commissioned a professional survey of his property. It revealed significant discrepancies between the actual legal boundaries and the fence lines that had been maintained by previous property owners and neighboring ranchers for several decades. The survey had shown that Ralph's legal property line extended approximately 30 FT further north than the existing fence line, encompassing a small but valuable section of improved pasture that Gary had been using as part of his grazing operation for over 20 years. The disputed area included a natural spring that provided crucial water access for Gary's cattle during the dry summer months that were characteristic of the hill country climate, where surface water could be scarce and reliable water sources were essential for successful ranching operations. The spring had been developed by Gary's father in the 1970s, with improvements that included a concrete apron, stock tank, and distribution system that allowed efficient watering of cattle in multiple pastures during periods when other water sources became unreliable. Ralph's insistence on enforcing his legal property boundaries had threatened to disrupt Gary's cattle operation in ways that could have significant financial implications, particularly during drought periods when access to the spring water could mean the difference between profitable ranching and financial disaster. Gary had offered to purchase the disputed strip of land from Ralph, but negotiations had stalled over price and mutual respect between landowners, who understood that successful ranching required cooperation and flexibility in dealing with challenges posed by weather, markets, and natural resource limitations. Ralph's background as a petroleum engineer had given him a different perspective on property rights and legal boundaries, along with the financial resources to commission professional surveys and legal services that challenged the traditional practices that had governed land use in the area for generations. His insistence on strict enforcement of legal property boundaries had been viewed by Gary as an urban newcomer's failure to understand or respect the customs and practical considerations that made rural communities function effectively. The investigation showed that both men had been consulting attorneys and considering legal action to resolve their boundary dispute. But the slow pace of civil litigation and the high costs associated with property law disputes had created a situation where tensions continued to escalate without any clear resolution in sight. The legal system that was designed to resolve such disputes peacefully had proven inadequate to address the emotional and practical issues that made this particular conflict so intractable. Eugene's investigation into Ralph's murder revealed that the fatal shooting had occurred during what appeared to be an attempt by Ralph to install additional fence posts along the disputed boundary line, despite Gary's repeated warnings that such actions would be viewed as trespassing and property damage that would provoke a violent response. The shooting had taken place in broad daylight, from a position that suggested careful planning and deliberate intent rather than a spontaneous act of violence. The ballistics evidence showed that Ralph had been shot from a distance of approximately 300 yards using a high-powered hunting rifle that required considerable skill and experience to shoot accurately at such range. The precision of the shooting suggested that the killer had military or extensive hunting experience, along with detailed knowledge of Ralph's daily routines and property activities that would have allowed for careful planning of the ambush. Gary Patterson was the obvious suspect in Ralph's murder, given the ongoing property dispute and his known expertise with rifles that came from decades of hunting and ranch management activities that required accurate shooting for both hunting and predator control purposes. But Gary's alibi for the time of the shooting was complicated by the remote location of both properties and the lack of witnesses who could confirm his whereabouts during the critical time period. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Eugene discovered that the property dispute between Ralph and Gary was part of a larger pattern of boundary conflicts that had been developing throughout the hill country region as urban newcomers with financial resources and legal sophistication moved into areas that had previously been dominated by traditional ranching families who operated according to informal agreements and long-established customs rather than strict legal boundaries. Several similar cases had developed in neighboring counties, where retired professionals with urban backgrounds had purchased rural property and insisted on strict enforcement of legal boundaries that disrupted traditional practices and informal arrangements that had been maintained by ranching families for generations. The conflicts typically involved water rights, road access, or grazing areas that had been shared informally, but were subject to different interpretations under strict legal analysis. The investigation revealed that Gary Patterson had been in contact with other ranchers who were facing similar boundary disputes with urban newcomers and had attended meetings where the discussions had apparently included not just legal strategies, but also more direct approaches to resolving conflicts, with neighbors who were viewed as threats to traditional ranching practices and rural community values. Working with federal investigators, Eugene learned that the hill country property disputes were being influenced by organized groups that promoted violent resistance to what they characterized as urban invasion of rural communities by wealthy outsiders who use their financial resources and legal sophistication to disrupt traditional practices and force long-established ranching families off land that their families had worked for generations. The investigation expanded when Eugene discovered that similar property dispute murders were occurring throughout rural Texas, with a pattern that suggested coordinated violence targeting urban newcomers who had become involved in boundary disputes with traditional ranching families. The murders typically occurred during activities related to property boundary enforcement and were carried out with precision that suggested military training and careful planning rather than spontaneous violence. The sophistication of these operations became apparent when Eugene investigated the background of the property dispute between Ralph and Gary, which revealed that the legal and financial pressures that had escalated their conflict were being deliberately manipulated by third parties who had financial interests in acquiring rural property at below market prices by creating conditions that forced property owners into financial distress or legal difficulties. The investigation revealed that a development company based in Austin had been systematically researching rural properties that were suitable for subdivision and development, then using various techniques to create conflicts between neighboring property owners that would force sales at reduced prices or create opportunities to acquire land through foreclosure or legal action related to the disputes. The development company had been providing funding and legal support to urban newcomers like Ralph, who were willing to enforce strict property boundaries that would disrupt traditional ranching operations and create financial pressure on neighboring properties. The goal was to force traditional ranching families to sell their properties at below market prices to avoid costly legal disputes or to escape the stress and harassment associated with ongoing boundary conflicts. Gary Patterson had been targeted for acquisition by the development company because his ranch included valuable water rights and strategic location that would be essential for a planned residential development that would convert thousands of acres of ranching land into suburban housing communities designed to serve the expanding Austin metropolitan area. The investigation showed that Gary's violent response to Ralph's boundary enforcement had been encouraged and supported by organized groups that opposed urban development of rural areas and promoted violent resistance to what they characterized as an invasion by wealthy outsiders who were destroying traditional rural communities and ranch-based economies that had been the foundation of Texas culture for generations. The murder of Ralph Brennan had been planned and executed as part of a broader campaign of intimidation, designed to discourage urban newcomers from purchasing rural property or enforcing legal boundaries that conflicted with traditional ranching practices. The goal was to create a climate of fear that would prevent urban development of rural areas while maintaining the informal arrangements and traditional practices that benefited established ranching families. Eugene's investigation revealed that the property line murders were part of a sophisticated operation that combined legal manipulation, financial pressure, and violent intimidation to control rural land use in ways that benefited both traditional ranching interests and development. Companies that profited from acquiring land at below market prices through forced sales and foreclosure proceedings. And mutual respect between landowners who understood that successful ranching required cooperation and flexibility in dealing with challenges posed by weather, markets, and natural resource limitations. Ralph's background as a petroleum engineer had given him a different perspective on property rights and legal boundaries, along with the financial resources to commission professional surveys and legal services that challenged the traditional practices that had governed land use in the area for generations. His insistence on strict enforcement of legal property boundaries had been viewed by Gary as an urban newcomer's failure to understand or respect the customs and practical considerations that made rural communities function effectively. The investigation showed that both men had been consulting attorneys and considering legal action to resolve their boundary dispute. But the slow pace of civil litigation and the high costs associated with property law disputes had created a situation where tensions continued to escalate without any clear resolution in sight. The legal system that was designed to resolve such disputes peacefully had proven inadequate to address the emotional and practical issues that made this particular conflict so intractable. Eugene's investigation into Ralph's murder revealed that the fatal shooting had occurred during what appeared to be an attempt by Ralph to install additional fence posts along the disputed boundary line, despite Gary's repeated warnings that such actions would be viewed as trespassing and property damage that would provoke a violent response. The shooting had taken place in broad daylight from a position that suggested careful planning and deliberate intent rather than a spontaneous act of violence. The ballistics evidence showed that Ralph had been shot from a distance of approximately 300 wide using a high-powered hunting rifle that required considerable skill and experience to shoot accurately at such range. The precision of the shooting suggested that the killer had military or extensive hunting experience along with detailed knowledge of Ralph's daily routines and property activities that would have allowed for careful planning of the ambush. Gary Patterson was the obvious suspect in Ralph's murder, given the ongoing property dispute and his known expertise with rifles that came from decades of hunting and ranch management activities that required accurate shooting for both hunting and predator control purposes. But Gary's alibi for the time of the shooting was complicated by the remote location of both properties and the lack of witnesses who could confirm his whereabouts during the critical time period. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Eugene discovered that the property dispute between Ralph and Gary was part of a larger pattern of boundary conflicts that had been developing throughout the hill country region as urban newcomers with financial resources and legal sophistication moved into areas that had previously been dominated by traditional ranching, families who operated according to informal agreements and long-established customs rather than strict legal boundaries. Several similar cases had developed in neighboring counties where retired professionals with urban backgrounds had purchased rural property and insisted on strict enforcement of legal boundaries that disrupted traditional practices and informal arrangements that had been maintained by ranching families for generations. The conflicts typically involved water rights, road access, or grazing areas that had been shared informally, but were subject to different interpretations under strict legal analysis. The investigation revealed that Gary Patterson had been in contact with other ranchers who were facing similar boundary disputes with urban newcomers and had attended meetings where the discussions had apparently included not just legal strategies, but also more direct approaches to resolving conflicts with neighbors who were viewed as threats to traditional ranching practices and rural community values. Working with federal investigators, Eugene learned that the hill country property disputes were being influenced by organized groups that promoted violent resistance to what they characterized as urban invasion of rural communities by wealthy outsiders who use their financial resources and legal sophistication to disrupt traditional practices and force long-established ranching families off land that their families had worked for generations. The investigation expanded when Eugene discovered that similar property dispute murders were occurring throughout rural Texas with a pattern that suggested coordinated violence targeting urban Sioux newcomers who had become involved in boundary disputes with traditional ranching families. The murders typically occurred during activities related to property boundary enforcement and were carried out with precision that suggested military training and careful planning rather than spontaneous violence. The sophistication of these operations became apparent when Eugene investigated the background of the property dispute between Ralph and Gary, which revealed that the legal and financial pressures that had escalated their conflict were being deliberately manipulated by third parties who had financial interests in acquiring rural property at below market prices by creating conditions that forced property owners into financial distress or legal difficulties. The investigation revealed that a development company based in Austin had been systematically researching rural properties that were suitable for subdivision and development, then using various techniques to create conflicts between neighboring property owners that would force sales at reduced prices or create opportunities to acquire land through foreclosure or legal action. Related to the disputes, the development company had been providing funding and legal support to urban newcomers like Ralph, who were willing to enforce strict property boundaries that would disrupt traditional ranching operations and create financial pressure on neighboring properties. The goal was to force traditional ranching families to sell their properties at below market prices to avoid costly legal disputes or to escape the stress and harassment associated with ongoing boundary conflicts. Gary Patterson had been targeted for acquisition by the development company because his ranch included valuable water rights and strategic location that would be essential for a planned residential development that would convert thousands of acres of ranching land into suburban housing communities designed to serve the expanding Austin metropolitan area. The investigation showed that Gary's violent response to Ralph's boundary enforcement had been encouraged and supported by organized groups that opposed urban development of rural areas and promoted violent resistance to what they characterized as an invasion by wealthy outsiders who were destroying traditional rural communities and ranch-based economies that had been the foundation of Texas culture for generations. The murder of Ralph Brennan had been planned and executed as part of a broader campaign of intimidation designed to discourage urban newcomers from purchasing rural property or enforcing legal boundaries that conflicted with traditional ranching practices. The goal was to create a climate of fear that would prevent urban development of rural areas while maintaining the informal arrangements and traditional practices that benefited established ranching families. Eugene's investigation revealed that the property line murders were part of a sophisticated operation that combined legal manipulation, financial pressure, and violent intimidation to control rural land use in ways that benefited both traditional ranching interests and development companies that profited from acquiring land at below market prices through forced sales and foreclosure proceedings.